context of it, a little bit repetitious, but I'm not going to talk about Louisiana or any of that stuff. We're going to be dealing today with the third of my three kings. As I announced early on, these were not the three magi who came to wherever they happened to come to pay adoration to the baby Jesus. These are three kings who played significant roles in the evolution of monarchy in Israel and later in the kingdom of Judah. And we dealt first with David, who established the monarchy really as a formal institution for governance in the nation of Israel. He was sort of the father of his country in that sense. Moses established an identity for the people of Israel through the Sinai events and the wanderings, but did not get involved in establishing a mode of governance for Israel. And in fact, in the early years, the mode of governance was, as we said before, the Tribal the Tribal Confederation, where charismatic leaders rose up during times of trouble to lead their respective tribes and then retreated into the background. And as someone here helpfully mentioned, I was thinking of other examples. Mentioned Cincinnatus being of fame at VMI as a citizen soldier. The judges, in a way, were citizen soldiers. But it was David who had actually established the monarchy. He wasn't the first king. Saul was the first king, but didn't really establish a monarchical system. Solomon, his son, transformed the monarchy into a prosperous regional empire that covered a larger area than the blue and the red on this scale, on this map. This sort of would be David's empire, and this is going to be Josiah's down here in the red. Solomon's was slightly larger than that, ran down into the Sinai Peninsula, ran up a little bit further in the north in the direction of the ports of Tyre and Sidon. Josiah is in a different period and plays a different kind of role, whereas both David and Solomon were people who established something new and expanding, and in Solomon's case, presided over then its subsequent dissolution, because when he died and his son Rehoboam took over, Rehoboam not only followed some of the dysfunctional practices of Solomon, which we talked about at the end of the session last time, but also showed even greater preference for the two southern tribes, for the tribes that later incorporated the kingdom of Judah down here, and occasioned a rebellion by a rival figure, a military figure arising in the north by the name of Jeroboam, who was not related to Rehoboam in any sense. But the monarchy divided after Solomon's death. And when we look at Josiah, we're going to be looking at a figure who arises in the period of the divided monarchy, and in fact, fairly late in that period. This entry here from 721 from the Assyrian conquest of the north down to 586 with the Babylonian conquest in the south is the period in which we find yeah, I've got Josiah on there in small letters, located. And we'll talk a little bit about the conditions of that period of divided monarchy, as well as talking about Josiah as a personality. Josiah is somebody whose acquaintance I made fairly late in my studies and really came to get interested in when I was teaching political theory at BMI for the better part of 28 years is one of the things I offered. I tried to incorporate, and I'll say a little more about it at the end of the period here. I tried to incorporate it into figures who weren't normally treated in Western political theory courses. Often Western political theory was described as a survey of great thinkers from Plato to NATO. Well, I got a little to the left of that, a little to the right of it, and a little before it. And I tended to begin not with Plato, but in fact with the Chinese, and I'll say something more about them as we get further into my digressions. And to say something about Josiah, who was an entirely different tradition and yet fit in, particularly when we were looking at the evolution of democratic forms. Josiah was the king of Judah for 31 years, in the latter part of this period here, from 640 BCE, before the Common Era, as we put it these days, to 609. He came to the throne at the age of 8, but was in a regency situation in the beginning, and later on found himself by the age of 20 actually sitting on the throne and reigning as the king. He was the king in the kingdom of Judah, what appears in red on this map down here. It was the southern part of what had once been the United Monarchy under David and Solomon. The northern part of the former United Monarchy, what's in the blue up there, was the larger and more powerful part of the former United Monarchy. But in 721, it fell to the Assyrians, and at that point ceased to be an independent entity that will make a brief reappearance in Josiah's reign, but not terribly significantly. The southern kingdom, Judah, consisted of two, traditionally, two of the 12 tribes of Israel. And it was not in the main path of Assyrian expansion. That didn't mean it was free from Assyrian influence, but it was not directly occupied by the Assyrians as the northern 10 tribes were. The northern 10 tribes have sometimes been referred to as the lost tribes of Israel, and that finds its way into all sorts of fictional literature, including the Book of Mormon. Sorry. You missed that the first time around. The northern 10 tribes weren't lost. Some of the leadership, when Assyria conquered the north, was forced into exile in Assyria or other Assyrian-controlled lands. Much of it remained just where it was, but what it lacked was any particular autonomy, at least until briefly in Josiah's reign. The southern kingdom wasn't in the main path of Assyrian expansion and survived with varying degrees of independence for another century and a half until falling to the Babylonians, arguably in 586, depends on which date you choose for the fall of Jerusalem and some other crucial events that had to do with the beginning of the exile. Josiah had Southern Kingdom royal farebears of varying qualities. When you read through, particularly the Book of Kings and the judgment it passes on various kings, both of the northern and southern kingdoms, most of them don't get very good ratings. They tend to be rated on a couple of qualities. One of them, their adherence to the Orthodox Yahwist cult, and one involving their support for the centralization of the cult in the Temple in Jerusalem. Other stuff gets measured around the edges, like in general, they were scoundrels or something like that. Most of the royal forebears in the Southern Kingdom, who tended to get better report cards than the ones in the North had gotten previously, were mostly mediocre. A few of them were truly despicable. And one that we'll talk about in a minute was, in addition to Josiah, prominently virtuous and effective. That one was Hezekiah, who reigned for roughly 30 years from 715 to 786. He was, as near as I can calculate, sometimes I get confused by these things, was Josiah's great-grandfather. In any case, he was, 3 generations earlier. He probably gets the most favorable press for personal qualities of any of the kings of Judah in that period. He's the one who is singled out for the most part, and particularly until near the end of his life, as being exemplary in his personal virtue. An influential member of Hezekiah's court, with whom you may be familiar from other contexts, was the prophet Isaiah. Often known, if we're talking here about first Isaiah, second Isaiah probably, third Isaiah arguably, this is first Isaiah, the one who's known as the royal Isaiah. And he is a counselor often listened to in the court of Hezekiah. Hezekiah had a reputation as a reformer, and Josiah took his great-grandfather, if that's the way the generations work out, as a model for his reign. His successor, when removed, Josiah's grandfather, Manasseh, was a thoroughgoing scoundrel. He had it all going for him. He perverted the cult. He adopted foreign practices. He was corrupt. He was not very pleasant. And Josiah took him, as many others did, as the model for everything that could go wrong in kingship. So those are the two poles in Josiah's experience. Hezekiah, a favorable one, although not. And Hezekiah gets more press than any of the others. In the Book of Kings, you learn much more about Hezekiah's reign, but it's not as interesting in terms of the history of reform as Josiah's is. And Josiah also fits in a more interesting historical period. That's the reason they took him as the reformer king rather than Hezekiah in my example for today. An important part of the positive context for Josiah's reign was something that became known as the Deuteronomic movement. What is it we know as the Book of Deuteronomy, the Old Testament? Who can tell me sort of briefly what's in it and why it's significant? And then I'll tell you why it's not identical with the Deuteronomic movement. But anybody want to? Well, he's cheating. Anybody without a mask want to tell me anything about it? All right, as long as we've got to start with the right answer, go ahead, tell us.
Right, but I usually think of it as a recapitulation of the book of Exodus, but
counting noses.
written. No, it's not really counting noses, but it's presented as being Moses recapitulating the law at that moment they're about to enter into the land, whereas Exodus is the statement of the law at the moment of receiving it at Sinai.
And what does the name Deuteronomy sort of suggest?
The second law.
The second law. Okay, the second incarnation of the law.
Deuteronomic.
Yeah. And we'll see how that all fits in. But we're going to have to distinguish between three separate things as we're talking about Josiah. We're going to have to talk a little bit about the context of the entire Deuteronomic movement. We're going to have to talk a little bit about a scroll mysteriously appearing in the temple under Josiah's reign. And then we're going to have to talk a little bit about the book of Deuteronomy per se, which is written in its complete form or its current form later on. We'll touch on all of those as we go along. What was the Deuteronomic movement? And where did it come from? Most scholars, I think all scholars today, would trace its origins to a collection of refugee priests from the former Northern Kingdom who migrated several decades before Josiah's reign from the north to the south and began to establish themselves in positions as responsible spokesmen for a certain point of view, or dissidents who were rebelling against other ideas that were current at the time. And as legal theorists, what they emphasized was the primacy of strict Mosaic law in all its aspects. They were covenanters, if you will, and we'll see that the concept of covenant reappears in Josiah's time. Their teachings formed the core of the later book of Deuteronomy. They were also important, however, for their contributions to the historical writings in the final forms of the books of Samuel and Kings, as they were incorporated into those books, and those books were taking shape. In this connection, the Deuteronomists were noted for their opposition on the secular side to arbitrary rule. And they could be seen, in a sense, as the descendants of the traditional Samuel critique at the time when the monarchy was being established. There are several stories about how Samuel felt about anointing the first king of Israel, or the second for that matter. And he, in some accounts, saw it as a real necessity, and in some accounts saw it as something regrettable. And in fact, as was often the case with Old Testament prophets and other commentators, got into prolonged arguments with God about whether God really knew what he was doing. It's a little reminiscent of parts of the book of Job, where Job was, for a while, calling into question God's wisdom until God finally says to him, "Where were you when I created the world?" Well, that's sort of what he says to Samuel eventually. But Samuel represents a dissident tradition that is later incorporated into the Deuteronomic histories, along with other things. And what one sees there, although they conditionally support the necessity for monarchy or even its desirability, they are critical with respect to arbitrary rule. They want a monarchy which has clear limits that are known and are observed. And that's a key tenet of the Deuteronomic historians. They also are noted for their opposition to pagan influences. We'll see a considerable amount of that as we proceed in our discussion this morning. There's an irony here, because in the book of Deuteronomy, when the conquest takes place, the Israelites have been enjoined to exterminate all the bad guys. Canaanites who are resistant to Yahwistic reforms are supposed to be dealt with by death. There's a campaign of, if you will, extermination that's called for in the book of Deuteronomy. It doesn't happen. And Canaanite influence, pagan and otherwise, continues right down into Josiah's reign. It continues through all these periods. It's not dominant necessarily, although in some periods it is dominant, but it's there. Okay? So although there's a very absolutist condemnation of pagan influence and Canaanite pagan influence in the Deuteronomic histories and in later the book of Deuteronomy, that's not really historical description of what was going on. How do the Deuteronomists, yeah, I'm going to be glad when I don't have to say that again. Deuteronomists and Josiah relate to each other. Well, they're certainly mutually supportive. If we look at least the matures of Josiah, he is in the Deuteronomic tradition. We'll talk about what that means as we get further into it. The relationship was sort of a, I think you could say, a push-me-pull-me relationship. Some observers would say that the Deuteronomists were the inspiration for Josiah's reform. Some would say that Josiah propelled the Deuteronomists into a position of prominence when he began his reforms. Doesn't really matter. Okay? They're both on the same side. Push me, pull me, if you will. If we proceed now into Josiah's reign, according to the Book of Kings, and there are two accounts, well, of kings in general, one in the Book of Kings, one in the Book of Chronicles, and they're a little bit different. The Book of Kings is written as much as 150 years or more after the events it describes, but still probably in the pre-exilic period. The Book of Chronicles is probably a product of the post-exilic period. It's got more historic separation, and it's got a different set of concerns. And it, in a sense, is concerned with polishing the image of a monarchy which is no longer a threat. By the time you get to the post-exilic period, people aren't worried about a Davidic monarchy that's too strong. They're worried to some extent about a monarchy that can't rule. And so the Book of Chronicles, in accounting for earlier rulers, tends to paint a more favorable picture of them than the Book of Kings. And when it paints an unfavorable picture, it's a more measured, unfavorable picture. We'll see how that relates to Josiah in a minute or two. Josiah is, according to the Book of Kings, in the 20th year of his reign. And at that time, according to the king's account, there's a chance discovery in the temple by the priest Hilkiah. He's not the chief priest, but he's one of the most prominent of the priests, and he's, in a sense, I guess, a lieutenant of Josiah's, who's supervising parts of renovation of what was traditionally seen as a forgotten scroll of the law. It was recovered by chance during this renovation of the Jerusalem temple at Josiah's direction in the 20th year of his reign. Why was the temple being renovated? At a minimum, it had suffered structural neglect under King Manasseh. He did not attach a great deal of importance to the temple. He allowed its physical structure to deteriorate. He also allowed mostly foreign, but in any case, anti-Yahwistic principles to profane its ritual. a thorough housekeeping, at least physically and probably in other ways, seemed to be in order. The scroll, as it's often referred to in both the Deuteronomic histories and in the Book of Deuteronomy, is described in Kings as a book of the law, whatever that means. Traditionally, Jewish authorities believed it to be the Book of Deuteronomy that currently figures as one of the 5 books of the Orthodox Jewish Torah. That is not true. I think that's not saying too much. What it was more likely is an earlier collection of legal material that was later incorporated into the Book of Deuteronomy, probably in the post-exilic period. Some scholars, and I don't know exactly how they put it together because they don't have the scroll that Hilkiah found, but some scholars would say that,
Unless it's the Book of Deuteronomy.
yeah, well, then it's 100%. But I've already made some comment about skepticism on that account. Some would say that it's about half of the Torah version of the Book of Deuteronomy. I would, be interested to see, these red letter editions that they have in the New Testament, where Jesus's words are in red letters and other words are in black letters. I would like to see the Deuteronomy version of this, where the original scroll is in red letters and the rest of it's in black letters. I haven't seen that yet. But the estimate would be that about a half of the content of the current Book of Deuteronomy originates from the scroll that was discovered in the temple and related writings to it. It does contain an account, which is also in the scriptural account in Deuteronomy, of the giving of the law to Moses, of the essence of the content of the law, beginning with the Decalogue, but then going on to other things, social and dietary legislation. And importantly, it contained, as the Book of Deuteronomy does, a dire prediction of the bad things that would happen if the law was not observed. Some scholars believe that the original accounts of the giving of the Mosaic law, of the covenant by which the people of Israel are established, took its pattern from some secular treaties that were common in the Hittite realm in the same period. They were known as suzerainty treaties. They were treaties between a foreign king and the Hittite suzerain. And they would be treaty provisions for mutual behavior and for what would happen if you broke the treaty. They were secular treaties. They're not the same thing as the Mosaic Covenant. But there are a number of scholars who see the parallels between the way the provisions are presented and the enumeration of the blessings and curses, as they put it, that will befall people depending on whether they break the treaty or observe the treaty. Be that as it may, certainly the Mosaic law contains those provisions. Hilkiah finds this scroll, sometimes referred to as a book, but don't think of it as a bound book. It's just an expression. During this renovation of the temple, and it is supposedly a chanced discovery. In the Book of Kings account, Josiah is described as shocked by the contents of this book. And particularly by the fact that it contains not only provisions for what to do and not to do, but for the dire consequences if you don't follow its injunctions, which is obvious to Josiah, have not been followed historically by all of his forebears, including his grandfather Manasseh. And in the Book of Kings account, in a penitent posture, pursuant to his shock, he rents his garments. I was going to say, and he dresses in sackcloth and ashes, and I discovered rereading the text that he didn't. He just rented his garments. I guess he was afraid that if he tore them up, he couldn't send them back to the rental company or whatever. But he rented his garments as a sign of penitence and a way of seeking God's forgiveness for Judah's sins. Not his personal sins so much, but for the sins of his predecessors and the sin of the kingdom of Judah. At that point, you consult an expert. Hilkiah recommends that they show the scroll to I don't know if it's proper to say anymore, a prophetess, a female prophet. It's prophetess approved language still, I don't know, by the name of Huldah, who is well known and has high authoritative prestige and orthodox credentials within the kingdom. And she looks over the scroll and she basically says, you folks are in big trouble. And that includes you, Josiah, even though you worked around when most of the stuff was being done. Your reign is going to be cursed and is going to end badly. In the Book of Kings, Huldah never changes her mind. In the Book of Chronicles, she relents later on because of her generally supportive view of the monarchy. Okay. But she basically says, no matter what you do in the way of reform, it ain't going to be enough. Okay. You folks are all in trouble. Well, Josiah acts upon what has been discovered or purportedly discovered. And he assembles the people of Judah, their leadership, their priests, their prophets, their people living in Jerusalem, to inform them about the scroll and to announce the actions he's going to be taking in terms of reform. Talk a little bit later when we get into the provisions about the significance of assembling the people for this purpose. There's some scholarly dispute, which is usually my way of saying I tend to believe the other guys, about the accuracy of the account in the Book of Kings. One interpretation holds that the book, as in fact portrayed, is a collection of writings from an earlier period that had been either suppressed, perhaps by Manasseh, or simply forgotten during neglect of the temple. Less credible is the part of that account that says Josiah was surprised and shocked by the book's contents. There are 45 years that pass between the death of Hezekiah, the reformer, and Josiah's accession as a youth. And then 12 years later coming to the throne. It would seem to me at least unlikely that those 45 years would account for the total obliteration from memory of the entire Mosaic tradition. Book of Chronicles, as we'll see in a minute, gives further support to that theory. In fact, according to the alternate account of Chronicles, Josiah, by the age of 20, well before the discovery of the scroll 20 years later, by the age of 20, has already taken steps in the direction of reform. In the Chronicles account, a lot of those reformist steps are similar to the ones that he does take after finding the scroll. In the Book of Kings, his reforms are seen as more limited, but it is clear that the renovation of the temple is already well underway before the scroll is discovered in a musty corner of the temple. Okay. Why is Josiah renovating the temple before the discovery of the scroll if the whole Mosaic tradition has been forgotten? Both accounts do acknowledge that he'd already begun the renovations to the temple, and that was seemingly a reformist measure. It seems to me, even if you take those accounts more or less at face value, that it is likely that Josiah's reaction when being confronted with the lost scroll might have been one of pleasant surprise, because it was reinforcing inclinations he'd already demonstrated. Might he have feigned shock to increase the dramatic effect of the discovery? It's altogether possible. It reminds me a little bit like the French commandant of police in the movie Casablanca, who, learning that gambling was proceeding at Rick's Casablanca nightclub, confronts Rick and says, "I'm shocked." Okay. Which is a little bit suspicious because he'd been a patron of the nightclub for some time, and many of his close associates were involved in the gambling. I don't want to read too much from the prefect of police's reaction in Casablanca to Josiah's reaction, but I would tend to think that even if Josiah was surprised, he would have been at least somewhat pleasantly surprised and somewhat gratified by it. There's an alternate interpretation, however, which I also give some credence to without 100% endorsing it, that suggests Josiah may not have even been surprised. This interpretation goes by the label of the Pious Fraud. That's not a biblical label, that's a scholarly label. Okay. But it suggests that the priests of Josiah, who were of Deuteronomic sympathies in their restoration of the temple, were the actual authors of the scroll that was found. They didn't find it in a musty box of robes and garments and things like that, but they wrote it and revealed it. And quite possibly they did that with Josiah's foreknowledge. We have no scriptural justification for that. It's speculation. Or even at his direction. I leave you with that as a possibility. I don't think Josiah was shocked and discouraged by finding it. Beyond that, you know, you've got gradations of Josiah's reaction, and I don't think it's particularly productive to try to find any kind of scriptural support for any of the various theories. But I don't think he was shocked and dismayed. Even if the book found or the scroll found may have been fraudulent, it was a pious fraud, okay? The reform that resulted from it under Josiah was genuine and thoroughgoing. And in some ways, as I'll mention as we go along, at a secular level, it could be seen as proto-democratic. It has various levels. It has ritual levels, it has ethical levels, it has practical political theory levels. When Josiah has looked the book over and given it some thought, his first definitive step is to assemble the leaders and the people of Judah. Sounds like all of them, to be witnesses and participation in the initiation of the reform. What's going to happen here is an essentially a renewal of the idea of the covenant. It's a covenant renewal ceremony that's going to ensue. It's interesting that it involves assembling all people. In Jewish tradition, which is not necessarily the same as the historical record, all Israel was present at Sinai. That's not a biblical reference. This is a traditional Jewish ascription to the Sinai's events. It didn't mean that every Israelite was assembled at Sinai, but it was basically saying they are all involved in it, they are all bound by it. And that's not only Israelites in the desert at the time, but that's Jews down to the present day. All Israel was present at Sinai. All Israel is a party to the covenant. Josiah, in a sense, is doing the same thing when he assembles the leaders of the people of Judah to be both witnesses to the reading of the scroll and participation in the initiation of reform. All Judah was present at the pillar in the courtyard when Josiah reads the book, which is what, in fact, he first does. He's standing by a pillar, presumably in the temple courtyard, and he reads the entire book of the law contained in the scroll. Probably a fair piece of reading, even if it's only half of the present book of Deuteronomy. Whether they were spellbound for a full 3 hours, I don't know. People had greater tolerance for long political speeches in those days, though. And in some countries, they still have that patience. One of the important things in the reading of the law and the provision that it then is to be required reading annually in a public assembly is that the law must be known to be valid, must be known in order to be valid. Okay? Unknown law, from certainly a democratic perspective, has questionable validity. A lot of societies are governed by law that is not known. We've had recent years a lot of examples of that. Going back to early times when I was dealing with the Chinese as the introduction of my course of political theory, I looked at the Confucians, who tended to be ethically oriented, although some of them believed man was good and therefore needed a light yoke of government, and some of them believed man was self-interested and needed a heavier yoke. Nevertheless, the orientation was human betterment and ethical behavior. There's a rival group of theorists, more practically oriented in China during the period known as the Legalists. And these folks believed that the guys on top had a right to be on top, and that the purpose of the law was to keep the guys on top. And their theory was that the law itself is sacred, because people who break a small law are just as dangerous to the order as people who break a major law. There are some slight parallels to that in Jewish legal thinking, in the sense that the law is regarded as a whole, okay, and that it's all to be observed. But the Chinese legalists basically said, it doesn't matter whether it's a just law, an unjust law, it's part of our mechanism of control, and we lose our authority if it isn't all observed. And any damn fool can punish a serious breach with a serious punishment. But it takes a creative man to punish a minor breach with a serious punishment. punishment. And running down into more contemporary times, I'm reminded that I've got some ready help here who realizes my disabilities. Thank you. I'll try to keep them on my nose. If you think of Nicolae Ceausescu in Romania during the 70s and into the 80s, a guy that some Americans fell in love with because he tended to be, although a member of the Warsaw Pact, anti-Soviet, and flirted with the Chinese. And Richard Nixon, during his visit to Romania, treated him as if he was an inspiration, and was inclined, because of his experience there, to model the White House police with plastic shako caps that followed the example of Ceausescu's palace guard in Romania. In any case, it was well known that people who were purged by Ceausescu never knew why. You didn't want them to know why, because if they knew why, they could provide a certain defense. You had to keep them guessing. And it was well known that he went out of his way to find legal provisions which he could accuse people of, which they never would have anticipated and couldn't defend against. Well, that's not a democratic principle. The democratic principle is that if law is to be valid, it must not only be just, but it must be known. And that's what Josiah is doing when he assembles the leaders and the people to hear him read the law and to require the reading of the law annually in the future. Going beyond that, Josiah then explicitly bound himself to the covenant that was contained in the scroll. How the king was supposed to behave and what was going to happen to him if he didn't. This is pretty powerful stuff. When you think about it, you got all the people assembled there, and you say, and here's what I'm bound to do, and you know what it is, and if I don't observe it, you're all witnesses to it. He then went on to note that the entire assemblage there, the people of Judah, were bound by the same restrictions. This is a we the people of event. We the people event. We had a textbook that when I was forced to teach American government from time to time at BMI, was entitled We the People.
Isn't it kind of a Magna Carta event? That is, it's the rule of law, not men. That's the essential.
Give me that again. I think I'll disagree with you on 2 points. Go ahead.
The essential character of this event is that
Yes.
is that it's the rule of law.
Yeah.
Not the rule of.
Yeah, let's drop the Magna Carta for the moment. Let's say the essential part of this event is that it's the presentation of the Constitution.
Yeah.
Known in that context as the covenant.
That the monarch himself
Is bound by it.
bound by.
Magna Carta is a more complicated subject. Who is bound by it and how far they're bound by it is a different question. But if you use the word Constitution, I think it's quite fair to say this is a constitution for the people of Judah. A we the people of event.
Well, the people aren't making the law, they're just bound by it.
Well, they are not making the law, but they're binding themselves to it. And I'm not sure there's a difference.
Well, I think there's a big difference.
Okay. They are considered to be bound by it.
But they're not sovereign. The people are not sovereign.
Maybe, maybe not. The intent of the covenant is to make the people sovereign.
Oh my goodness.
Oh, it's an oh my goodness event.
No, I just don't see the people at all being sovereign here.
If all Israel is present in
It's God
Sinai.
who is sovereign.
I mean, this is in the theory that you're dealing with. But if all Israel is present at Sinai, and if all Judah is present at the reading of the law, they're in it over their heads whether they want to be or not. And what happens to them if they're not? is that they're seen as violators of this Constitution.
Absolutely, but not sovereign.
No, they're not sovereign.
We are sovereign.
Yeah, in our Constitution, the
Oh,
meaning of the
in-
phrase, "we
yes.
the people," is that we are the sovereign.
Yes,
Making the
yes. And I'm not trying to say,
In this event, it's
and
not.
I'm
the
not
people.
trying to say that Josiah is
It's
John
not
Locke.
the people making the law, it's the source of God telling them.
Well, this is a theocracy.
Yeah.
No, I'm not maintaining Josiah as John Locke. I'm maintaining it's very interesting that all the people are witnesses and must participate.
Sure.
It has both ritual and practical provisions. One of the ritual provisions, which actually surprised me when I started looking at what it all actually said in the Book of Kings, is the provision for an elaborate public celebration of the Passover and a mass public gathering. I had not really focused on that before, because it's recorded in the Book of Kings that Passover had not been celebrated that way since the days of Samuel.
Yeah.
And I had not really focused on it. And I went back quickly to see, if the Book of Kings had made a terrible mistake. And I could not find any indication of the Passover being celebrated during the period of the United Kingdom or even in the
It's
Divided Kingdom.
mentioned under Solomon, but
That it was publicly celebrated?
well, it's unclear. It's
I
just
couldn't-
mentioned, it's just mentioned that it's celebrated.
Yeah, I couldn't find that. And the Book of Kings, which, well, again, it would depend on whether you're looking at Solomon and Chronicles, I suppose. But the Book of Kings would be unlikely to mention the Passover.
But throughout Judges and Kings and Samuel, there's a marked absence of
Yeah,
any of the ritual
Yep.
requirements
and certainly the public
of the
celebration.
law, which brings into question whether they do
Yep.
anything about it.
And the connection of it in any way to the temple,
Right.
which has a clear Passover connection in other times. So you have the reinstitution of the celebration of public Passover. Also, the purging of the temple of pagan cult objects. And I don't think, even though they're abundantly mentioned in the Old Testament and in negative fashion in the Deuteronomic histories, I don't think we always focus too much on the pagan cult presence throughout the period of Judges, United Monarchy, Divided Monarchy. They are cult objects and they are cult practices. And the reaction to them is typically Deuteronomic historian, the same thing that motivates the idea that you have to exterminate the Canaanite people who do not embrace the Yahwistic principles. Also says you got to exterminate the people who are promoting the paganism. And here we kind of go back to, if you think about the fire making ceremony on Mountain, and what happens to the priests of Baal when it's all over, they are killed. The Deuteronomic history is ruthless in its treatment of these things. And Josiah is recorded as executing the anti-Yahwistic temple priests. On the secular side, he redistributes wealth to the poor. Some of it is from the temple treasury, which he regards as being excessive to the needs of the temple. Some of it is funds that have been raised in other fashion. But it is economic redistribution as a secular reform. He also expands his temporal realm into Samaria, the area that would be down sort of here. Well, down sort of in this area here, in the northern kingdom, nominally under Assyrian control. But By then, Assyria's power is waned, and there's a little bit of a power vacuum within which Josiah can play a role. So there's secular reform, there's liturgical reform, there's ethical reform involved in all of this. It's far-reaching, and it seems to be sincere and pretty much observed during the remaining period of Josiah's lifetime. All of these actions are consistent with the viewpoint of Deuteronomic historians: the covenant, ritual purification, purging foreign influences, executing the bad guys, including particularly necromancers, people who call up the spirits of the dead and communicate with them. This is a major no-no in the book of Deuteronomy. It is an offense against God's sovereignty, as well as being a ritual offense. And doing this ruthlessly and approving of territorial expansion. Okay, reform collapses. Josiah is killed in battle with the Egyptians in a conflict with the Pharaoh Necho and Megiddo at the age of 39. This is not that long after he's begun his reform. This is in 609. Things then get really bad. His son Jehoahaz, 23 when he comes to the throne, in the judgment of the Deuteronomic historians, did evil in the sight of the Lord. That's one of the pat phrases saying this guy is a no good name. And Jehoahaz reigned for only 3 months. That's good. He was deposed by the Pharaoh, actually, who had appointed him, and replaced him with his son Jehoiakim, who reigned for 11 years. And he also did evil in the sight of the Lord. He was replaced by Jehoiakim, who also did evil in the sight of the Lord, and he only reigned 3 months before he was taken prisoner by the invading Babylonians by that time, during their first incursion. His successor, Zedekiah, same sad story. He reigned for 11 years before Jerusalem finally fell in 586, but he was a puppet, really, of foreign powers during most of that time. 4 bad kings take Josiah's place in 25 years. It's the end of Josiah's line and of Judah's independence. The exile begins, and the Davidic line, for all practical purposes, expires. There is never again a serious candidate for the throne who is in the Davidic line. These accounts in the King's account are not sufficient. God's approval of Josiah to make him turn back from the prophetess Hulda's prophecy that ruin is coming. In the Book of Chronicles, God relents, but ruin comes anyhow. Where does that leave Josiah's reforms? In the Jewish tradition, one sees here with the exile and the extinction of the practical monarchy until the post-exilic period, and when it's restored, it's something quite different from the Davidic monarchy, the time of Ezra and Nehemiah, and then when you get further down to the Maccabees, it's an entirely different kind of animal. Insofar as it expires as a practical requirement, the idea of the Davidic Covenant never shall there fail on the throne of Israel a descendant of the house of David. That's gone. You can't even find descendants of the house of David in the post-exilic period, but they're not sitting on the throne during the exilic period. What happens is that the whole ideology of the Davidic monarchy is transformed into the messianic hope. You no longer have the Davidic king who is going to rule Israel in a proximate historical period. But you project all this, even if he is a real secular king, to the end of time and the messianic expectation. We see this still alive in the New Testament. In the book of Matthew, when it discusses Joseph's ancestry, he is of the house of lineage of David. Okay, so his line is legitimate in terms of the messianic hope, if not in terms of the inheritance of the throne. Now that's a little peculiar when juxtaposed with another doctrine that the church adopted a couple centuries later of the virgin birth, because Joseph's lineage in the house of the lineage of David is fairly irrelevant at that point if you accept both of these propositions. But it remains alive as a messianic hope, which in almost an informal, superstitious, popular way among some Orthodox Jews is present today in their expectations of male heirs. I had an Orthodox Jewish neighbor when I was growing up. Working class people, fairly simple people, who treated their son, they had two daughters and son, as the potential Messiah. How seriously did they believe it? I don't know. But they certainly showed him every favoritism that was involved in this messianic hope. Now, there's no Orthodox, even Jewish provision for endorsing that point of view. It's a popular opinion, but it shows the power of this myth. At a very different level, having nothing to do with Judaism and the Messianic hope, Josiah lives on in my political theory courses as an example from a different time and place of proto-democratic impulses. Not thoroughly, and Tuck's points were valid, and it wasn't contrary to the point I was trying to make. But in the sense that it's we the people, in the sense that the law is known, in the sense that the ruler is bound by the law, there's a proto-democratic part there. And I chose, because of that, to include in my courses not only the Confucians and the Chinese legalists on different sides of the issue, but Josiah as an unexpected example of something we usually attribute to the ancient Greeks. And I think it's important to see both sides of that legacy. Not that Josiah anticipated being a prototype for the Messianic hope, and certainly not that he anticipated being a prototype for Aristotle, but in a different sense, because we have a tendency to see those things in Greco-Roman terms. Well, I think I've expired, or I think our time is expired. I think our time expired only shortly before I expired. So I'm going to be here for a few minutes cleaning up my stuff, and then who knows what might happen to me. But I'm not telling. And any of you who want to chat a little further, you can do it while I'm up here finishing my exploration.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
You say his reforms failed. Is there a reason?
Well, his first reason is that he was killed.
But that would do it.
That's kind of definitive. And then he was succeeded by